Hi, guys. So we figured out the glitch with my microphone, so we should be good to go. So here it is on Wednesday afternoon, and I'm going to record chapter 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, so that should be ready to rock and roll for you. All right, so here we go. Chapter 3, chapter 4. Catching Walter Cunningham in the schoolyard gave me some pleasure, but when I was rubbing his nose in the dirt, Jim came by and told me to stop. "You're bigger than he is," he said. "Well, he's as old as you nearly," I said, "and he made me start off on the wrong foot." "Let him go, Scout." "Why?" "He didn't have any lunch," I said, and I explained my involvement in Walter's dietary affairs. Walter had picked himself up and was standing quietly listening to Jim and me. His fists were half cocked, as if expecting an onslaught from both of us. I stomped at him to chase him away, but Jim put out his hand and stopped me. He examined Walter with an air of speculation. "Your daddy, Mr. Walter Cunningham from Old Sarum?" he asked, and Walter nodded. Now, Walter looked like he'd been raised on fish food. His eyes were as blue as Dale Harris's, and they were red-rimmed and watery. There was no color in his face except the tip of his nose, and it was moistly pink. He fingered the straps of his overalls, nervously picking at the metal hooks. Jim suddenly grinned at him. "Come on home to dinner with us, Walter. We'd be glad to have you." Walter's face brightened and then darkened. Jim said, "Our daddy's a friend of your daddy's. Scout here, she's crazy. She won't fight you anymore." "I wouldn't be too sure of that," I said. Jim's free dispensation of my pledge irked me, but precious noontime minutes were ticking away. "Yeah, Walter, I won't jump on you again. Don't you like butter beans? Our cow's a real good cook." Walter stood where he was, biting his lip, and Jim and I gave up. And we were nearly to the Radley place when Walter called, "Hey, I'm coming." When Walter caught up with us, Jim made pleasant conversation with him. "Ooh, a Haint lives there," he said cordially, pointing to the Radley house. "You ever hear about him, Walter?" "Well, I reckon I have," said Walter. "I almost died the first year I come to school and I ate them pecans. Well, folks said he poisoned them, and he put them over at the school side of the fence." Jim seemed to have a little fear of Boo Radley now that Walter and I walked beside him. Indeed, Jim grew boastful. "I went all the way up to the house once," he said to Walter. "Well, anybody who went up to the house once ought not to still run every time he passes it," I said to the clouds above. "And who's running, Miss Priss?" "Well, you are when ain't anybody near you." By the time we reached our front steps, Walter had forgotten he was Cunningham, and Jim ran to the kitchen and asked Calpurnia to set an extra plate. We had company. Atticus greeted Walter and began a discussion about crops that neither Jim or I could follow. "Well, the reason I can't pass the first grade, Mr. Finch, is I've had to stay out and every spring and help Papa with the chopping, but there's another one at the house now that's field size." "Did you pay a bushel of potatoes for him?" I asked, but Atticus shook his head at me. While Walter piled food on his plate, he and Atticus talked together like two men, to the wonderment of Jim and me. Atticus was expounding upon farm problems when Walter interrupted to ask if there was any molasses in the house. Well, Atticus summoned Calpurnia, who returned bearing the syrup pitcher, and she stood waiting for Walter to help himself. Walter poured syrup on his vegetables and meat with a generous hand. He could have probably poured it into his milk glass had I not asked what the Sam Hill he was doing. So part of the reason he is doing that, having not had enough to eat and people are starving at this time, this is probably more food than Walter's seen in a long time, if ever. And so just like syrup on pancakes, it sticks to your ribs. So it's a treat to have that syrup. And all he's thinking about is getting as much food into his belly so he's not hungry. The silver saucer clattered when he replaced the pitcher, and he quickly put his hands in his lap. Then he ducked his head. Atticus shook his head at me again. "But he's gone and drowned his dinner in syrup," I protested. "He's poured it all over." And it was then that Calpurnia requested my presence in the kitchen. She was furious, and when she was furious, Calpurnia's grammar became erratic. Now, when in tranquility, her grammar was good as anybody's in Macon. Atticus said Calpurnia had more education than most colored folks. She squinted down at me with the tiny lines around her eyes deepened. Now, there are some folks who don't eat like us, she whispered fiercely, but you ain't called on to contradict them at the table when they don't. Now, that boy is your company, and if he wants to eat up the tablecloth, you let him, you hear? Oh, he ain't company, Cal, he just a Cunningham. Hush your mouth. Don't matter who they are. Anybody sets foot in this house, they's your company. And don't let me catch you remarking on their ways like you was so high and mighty. You folks might be better than the Cunninghams, but it don't count for nothing the way you disgrace them. And if you can't act fit to eat at the table, you can just sit there and eat in the kitchen. Calpurnia sent me through the swinging door to the dining room with a stinging smack. I retrieved my plate and I finished dinner in the kitchen, thankful, though, that I was spared the humiliation of facing them again. I told Calpurnia, you just wait. I'd fix her. One of these days, when she wasn't looking, I'd go off and drown myself in Barker's eddy. And then she'd be sorry. Besides, I added, she's already got me in trouble once today. She taught me to ride, and it was all her fault. Hush your fussing, she said. Jem and Walter returned to school ahead of me, staying behind to advise Atticus of Calpurnia's inequities was worth a solitary sprint past the Radley place. She likes Jem better than she likes me anyway, I concluded, and I suggested that Atticus lose no time in packing her off. Have you ever considered that Jem doesn't worry her half as much? Atticus's voice was flinty. I've no intention of getting rid of her now or ever. We couldn't operate a single day without Cal. Have you ever thought of that? You think about how much Cal does for you, and you mind her. You hear? While I returned to school, I hated Calpurnia steadily until a sudden shriek shattered my resentments. I looked up to see Miss Caroline standing in the middle of the room, sheer horror flooding her face. Apparently, she'd revived enough to persevere in her profession. It's alive! She screamed. Well, the male population of the class rushed as one to her assistance. Lord, I thought she scared of a mouse. Chuck Little, whose patience with all living things was phenomenal, he said, now which way did he go, Miss Caroline? You tell us where he went, quick. D.C., he turned to a boy behind him. D.C., you shut the door and we'll catch him. Now, quick, ma'am, where'd he go? Well, Miss Caroline, she pointed a shaking finger, not at the floor, not at the desk, but to a hulking individual unknown to me. Now, little Chuck's face contracted and he said gently, you mean him, ma'am? Oh, yes, he's alive. Did he scare you some way? Miss Caroline said desperately, I was just walking by. When it crawled out of his hair, it just crawled out of his hair. Little Chuck grinned proudly. There ain't no need to fear a cootie, ma'am. Ain't you ever seen one? Now, don't you be afraid. You just go back to your desk and you teach us some more. So, cooties are head lice. And if you know anything about lice, they jump. They move from person to person. So, this boy has lice that's his head's wiggling. There's that much lice. Okay? Little Chuck Little was another member of the population who didn't know where his next meal was coming from, but he was a born gentleman. He put his hand under her elbow and led Miss Caroline to the front of the room. Now, don't you fret, ma'am, he said. There's no need to fear a cootie. I'll just fetch you some cool water. The cootie's host showed not the faintest interest in the furor he had wrought. He searched the scalp above his forehead, located the guest, and he pinched it between his thumb and his forefinger. Miss Caroline watched the process in horrid fascination. Little Chuck brought a water in a paper cup, and she drank it gratefully. Finally, she found her voice. What is your name, son? She asked softly. The boy blinked. Who, me? Miss Caroline nodded. Burris Ewell. Miss Caroline inspected her roll book. I have a Ewell here, but I don't have a first name. Could you spell that your first name for me? I don't know how. They call me Burris at home. Well, Burris, said Miss Caroline, I think we'd better excuse you for the rest of the afternoon. I want you to go home and wash your hair. Now, from her desk, she produced a thick volume, leafed through it some pages, and she read for a minute. A good home remedy for. Burris, I want you to go home and wash your hair with lye soap. And when you're done with that, treat your scalp with kerosene. What for, missus? Well, to get rid of the cooties. You see, Burris, the other children might catch them, and you wouldn't want that, would you? Now, the boy stood up. He was the filthiest human I had ever seen. His neck was dark gray, and the backs of his hands were rusty, and his fingernails were black deep into the quick. Well, he peered at Miss Caroline from a fist-sized clean space on his face. No one had noticed him, probably because Miss Caroline and I had entertained the class most of the morning. And Burris, said Miss Caroline, please bathe yourself before you come back tomorrow. The boy laughed rudely. You ain't sending me home, missus. I was on the verge of leaving. I done my time for this year. Miss Caroline looked puzzled. What do you mean by that? The boy didn't answer. He gave a short, contemptuous snort. One of the elderly members of the class answered her. He's one of the Ewells, ma'am. And I wondered if this explanation would be as unsuccessful as my attempt. But Miss Caroline seemed willing to listen. Well, school's full of them. They come the first day every year and then leave. Oh, yeah, the Truett lady gets him here and because she threatens him with the sheriff, but she gave up trying to hold him. She reckons she carried out the law just getting their names on the roll and running them here the first day. You're supposed to mark them absent the rest of the year. But what about their parents? Asked Miss Caroline in genuine concern. I ain't got no mother, was the answer. And their pa's right contentious. Burris Ewell was flattered by the recital. I've been coming to the first day of the first grade for 3 years now, he said expansively. I reckon if I'm smart this year, they'll promote me to the second. Miss Caroline said, sit back down, Burris, please. And the moment she said it, I knew she'd made a serious mistake. The boy's condescension flashed to anger. You try and make me, missus. Little Chuck Little got to his feet. Let him go, ma'am, he said. He's a mean one, a hard-down mean one, and he's liable to start something, and there's some little folks here. Now, he was the one among the most diminutive of men, but when Burris Ewell turned toward him, little Chuck's right hand went to his pocket. You watch your step, Burris, he said. I'd soon kill you as look at you. Now go home. Burris seemed to be afraid of a child half his height, and Miss Caroline took advantage of his indecision. Burris, go home. If you don't, I'll call the principal, she said. I'll have to report this anyway. The boy snorted, and he slouched leisurely to the door. Safely out of range, he turned and shouted, Reportin' be damned to ye. Ain't no snot-nosed slut of a school teacher ever born can make me do nothing. You ain't making me go nowhere, missus. You just remember that. You ain't making me go nowhere. He waited until he was sure she was crying, and then he shuffled out of the building. Well, soon we were clustered around her desk, trying in our various ways to comfort her. Oh, he's a real mean one. Below the belt. You ain't called on to teach folks like that. Them ain't Macon's ways, Miss Caroline, not really. Now, don't you fret, ma'am. Miss Caroline, why don't you read us a story? That cat thing was real fine this morning. Miss Caroline smiled, blew her nose, and said, Thank you, darlings. Dispersed us, opened her book, and mystified the first grade with a long narrative about a toad frog that lived in a hall. Now, when I passed the Radley place for the fourth time that day, twice at full gallop, my gloom had deepened to match the house. If the remainder of the school year was as fraught with drama as the first day, Perhaps it'd be mildly entertaining, but the prospect of spending 9 months refraining from reading and writing made me think of running away. Now, by late afternoon, most of my traveling plans were complete. And when Jim and I raced each other up the sidewalk to meet Atticus coming home from work, I didn't give him much of a race. See, it was our habit to run meet Atticus the moment we saw him round the post office corner in the distance. Atticus seemed to have forgotten my noontime fall from grace. He was full of questions about school. Well, my replies were monosyllabic, and he didn't press me. So if you look on your map on the back side, find the post office. Oh, wait. Find the post office and mark that. So we know that Atticus's office is right across the street from the square, the county square, courthouse. And he walks home at lunchtime, and he walks home at the end of the day, that long north-south street by their house, and the kids run up and they meet him and then walk back down to home. Perhaps Calpurnia sensed that my day had been a grim one. She let me watch her fix supper. Shut your eyes and open your mouth. I'll give you a surprise, she said. It was not often she made crackling bread. She said she never had time, but with both of us at school today, it had been an easy one for her, and she knew I love crackling bread. I missed you today, she said. The house got so lonesome long about 2 o'clock, I had to turn on the radio. Why? Jim and me ain't ever in the house unless it's raining. I know, she said, but one of you is always in calling distance, and I wondered how much of the day I spend just calling after you. Well, she said, getting up from the kitchen chair, it's enough time to make a pan of crackling bread, I reckon. You run along now and let me get supper on the table. And then Calpurnia bent down and kissed me. I ran along, wondering what had come over her. She'd wanted to make up with me. That was it. She'd had always been too hard on me, and she'd at last seen the error of her fractious ways. She was sorry, and too stubborn to say so. Whew, I was weary from the day's crimes. After supper, Atticus sat down with a paper and called, Scout, you ready to read? The Lord sent me more than I could bear, and I went to the front porch. Atticus followed me. Something wrong, Scout? Well, I told Atticus I didn't feel very well, and I didn't think I'd go to school anymore if it was all right with him. Atticus sat down in the swing and crossed his legs, and his fingers wandered to his watch pocket. He said that was the only way he could think. He waited in amiable silence, and I sought to reinforce my position. You never went to school, and you do all right, so I'll just stay home too. You can teach me like Granddaddy taught you. And Uncle Jack. No, I can't, said Atticus. I have to make a living. Besides, they'd put me in jail if I kept you at home. Dose of magnesia for you tonight and school tomorrow. So he's thinking, if she's faking it, dose of milk of magnesia. Take a little bit of milk of magnesia and you're going to poop. And that's that. Well, of course, she knows that. She doesn't want that. I'm feeling all right. Really? I thought so. Now, what's the matter? Well, bit by bit, I told him the day's misfortunes. And she said that you taught me all wrong, so we can't ever read anymore, ever. Please don't send me back. Please, sir. Atticus stood up and he walked to the end of the porch. When he completed his examination of the wisteria vine, he strolled back to me. First of all, he said, if you can learn a simple trick, Scout, you're going to get along a lot better with all kinds of folks. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view. Sir? Till you climb into his skin and walk around in it. Atticus said I had learned many things today, and Miss Caroline had learned several things herself. She'd learned not to hand something to a Cunningham, for one thing. But if Walter and I had put ourselves in her shoes, we'd have seen it was an honest mistake on her part. We could not expect her to learn all of Makeham's ways in one day, and we could not hold her responsible when she knew no better. Well, I'll be dogged, I said. I didn't know no better than not to read to her, and she held me responsible. Listen, Atticus, I don't have to go to school. I don't. I was bursting with a sudden thought. Bar Sewell, you remember? He just goes to school the first day. The truant lady reckons she carried out the law when she gets his name on the roll. You can't do that, Scout, Atticus said. Sometimes it's better to bend the law a little in special cases. And in your case, the law remains rigid, so to school you go. Well, I don't see why I have to when he doesn't. Atticus said the Ewells had been the disgrace of Macomb for 3 generations. None of them had done an honest day's work in his recollection. He said that some Christmas when he was getting rid of the tree, he'd take me with him and show me where and how they lived. They were people, but they lived like animals. They can go to school anytime they want. When they show the faintest symptom of wanting an education, said Atticus. Now, there are ways of keeping them in school by force, but it's silly to force people like the Ewells into a new environment. Well, if I didn't go to school tomorrow, you'd force me to. Let's leave it at this, said Atticus dryly. You, Miss Scout Finch, are the common folk. You must obey the law. He said that the Ewells were members of an exclusive society made up of Ewells. In certain circumstances, the common folk judiciously allowed them certain privileges by the simple method of becoming blind to some of the Ewells' activities. They didn't have to go to school, for one thing. And another thing, Mr. Bob Ewell, Burris's father, was permitted to hunt and trap out of season. Oh, Atticus, that's bad, I said. In Macomb County, hunting out of season was a misdemeanor at law and a capital felony in the eyes of the populace. It's against the law, all right, said my father, and it's certainly bad. But when a man spends his relief checks on green whiskey, his children have a way of crying from hunger pangs. I don't know of any landowner around here who begrudges those children any game their father can hit. Well, Mr. Ewell shouldn't do that. Well, of course he shouldn't, but he'll never change his ways. Are you going to take out your disapproval on his children? No, sir, I murmured, and then I made a final stand. But if I keep on going to school, we can't read anymore. That's what's really bothering you, isn't it? Yes, sir. When Atticus looked down at me, I saw the expression on his face that always made me expect something. Do you know what a compromise is? He asked. Bending the law? No. The agreement reached by mutual concessions, and it works this way, he said. If you'll concede the necessity of going to school, we'll go on reading every night just as we always have. Is it a bargain? Yes, sir. Now, we'll consider it sealed without that usual formality, Atticus said when he saw me being prepared to spit. As I opened the front screen door, Atticus said, by the way, Scout, you'd better not say anything at school about our agreement. Why not? I'm afraid our activities would be received with considerable disapprobation by the more learned authorities. Jim and I were accustomed to our father's last will and testament diction, and we were at all times free to interrupt Atticus for a translation when it was beyond our understanding. Huh, sir? I never went to school, he said, but I have a feeling that if you tell Miss Caroline we read every night, she'll get after me, and I wouldn't want her after me. Atticus kept us in fits that evening, gravely reading columns of print about a man who sat on a flagpole for no discernible reason, which was reason enough for Jem to spend the following Saturday aloft in the treehouse. Jem sat from after breakfast until sunset, and he would have remained overnight had not Atticus severed his supply lines. I had spent most of the day climbing up and down, running errands for him, providing him with literature, nourishment, and water, and carrying him blankets for the night when Atticus said, if I paid no attention to him, Jim would come down. Atticus was right. So, what's the difference between the Ewells and the Cunninghams? Well, the difference is the Cunninghams, while they're very poor, they do not take handouts. They are productive citizens in the community. They struggle, but they will not take anything that they think or know that they can't pay back. They would rather starve than take charity. If they pay it back, like Mr. Cunningham did with Atticus, that's one thing. But just to do it, not happening. The Ewells, we're going to learn more about this family. The Ewells will take and take and take, and they never give back. And part of being a responsible, productive member of a community is give and take. Reciprocating, helping people that need help when you can. It doesn't have to be money. It could be lending a hand with something, sharing what you have. So while the Ewells and the Cunninghams are the same in poverty, they are not the same in being productive citizens. Okay? That's important to know as we go on here. Capiche? Yep. Okay, so we ready for chapter 4? All right. The remainder of my school days were no more auspicious than the first. Indeed, they were an endless project that slowly evolved into a unit in which miles of construction paper and wax crayon were expended by the state of Alabama in its well-meaning but fruitless efforts to teach me group dynamics. Now, what Jim called the Dewey Decimal System was school-wide by the end of my first year, so I had no chance to compare it with other teaching techniques. I could only look around me. Atticus and my uncle, who went to school at home. And they knew everything. Well, at least what one didn't know, the other one did. Furthermore, I couldn't help noticing that my father had served for years in the state legislature, elected each time without opposition, innocent of the adjustments my teachers thought essential to the development of good citizenship. Now, Jim, educated on half decimal, half dunce cap basis, seemed to function effectively alone or in a group, but Jim was a poor example. No tutorial system devised by man could have stopped him from getting at books. Now, as for me, I knew nothing except that from what I gathered from Time magazine and reading everything I could lay my hands on at home. But as I inched sluggishly along the treadmill of the Macomb County school system, I couldn't help receiving the impression I was being cheated out of something. And out of what, I knew not, yet I did not believe that 12 years of unrelieved boredom was exactly what the state had in mind for me. Now, as the year passed, released from school 30 minutes before Jim, who had to stay until 3 o'clock, I ran by the Radley place as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the safety of our front porch. And one afternoon, as I raced by, something caught my eye. And caught it in such a way that I took a deep breath and a long look around, and I went back. 2 live oaks stood at the edge of the Radley lot. Their roots reached out into the side road and made it bumpy. Something about one of the trees attracted my attention. Now, some tinfoil was sticking in the knothole just above my eye level, winking at me in the afternoon sun. And I stood on tiptoe. I hastily looked around once more. I reached into the hole, and I withdrew 2 pieces of chewing gum minus their outer wrappers. Now, my first impulse was to get it into my mouth as quickly as possible, but I remembered where I was. And I ran home, and on our front porch, I examined my loot. The gum looked fresh. I sniffed it, and it smelled all right. I licked it, and I waited for a while. When I did not die, I crammed it into my mouth. Wrigley's Double Mint. Now, when Jim came home, he asked me where I got such a wad, and I told him I found it. Don't eat things you find, Scout, Well, this wasn't on the ground, it was in the tree, Jim growled. Well, it was, I said. It was sitting in that tree yonder, the one coming from school. Spit it out right now. I spat it out. Well, the tang was fading anyway. I've been chewing it all afternoon and I ain't dead yet. I'm not even sick. Jim stamped his foot. Don't you know you're not supposed to even touch the trees over there? You'll get killed if you do. You touched the house once. That was different. You go gargle right now. You hear me? I ain't neither. It'll take the taste out of my mouth. You don't, and I will tell Calpurnia on you. Well, rather than risk a tangle with Calpurnia, I did as Jim told me. Now, for some reason, my first year of school had wrought a great change in our relationship. Calpurnia's tyranny, unfairness, and meddling in my business had faded to gentle grumblings of general disapproval. On my part, I went to much trouble, sometimes, not to provoke her. Summer was on the way, and Jem and I awaited it with impatience. Summer was our best season. It was sleeping on the back screen porch in cots, or trying to sleep in the treehouse. Summer was everything good to eat. It was 1,000 colors in a parched landscape. But most of all, summer was dull. Now, the authorities released us early the last day of school, and Jim and I walked home together. You reckon old Dale'll be coming home tomorrow? I said. Probably the day after, said Jim. Mississippi turns him loose a day later. Now, as we came to the live oaks at the Radley place, I raised my finger to point for the 100th time to the knothole where I found the chewing gum, trying to make Jim believe I'd found it there, and I found myself pointing at another piece of tinfoil. I see it, Scout. I see it. Jim looked around, reached up, and gingerly pocketed a tiny, shiny package. We ran home, and on the front porch, we looked at a small box patchworked with bits of tinfoil collected from chewing gum wrappers. It was the kind of box wedding rings came in, purple velvet with a minute catch. Now, Jim flicked open the tiny catch, and inside were 2 scrubbed and polished pennies, one on top of the other, and Jim examined them. Indian heads, he said, 1906. And Scout, one of them's 1900. These are real old. 1900, I echoed. Say! Now hush a minute. I'm thinking. Jim, you reckon that's someone's hiding place? Nah, don't anybody much but us pass by here unless it's some grown persons. Grown folks don't have hiding places. You reckon we ought to keep them, Jim? Well, I don't know what we could do, Scout. Who'd we give them back to? I mean, I know for a fact that don't anybody go down by there. Well, Cecil goes the back street all the way around by town to get home. So if you look on your map and you look where Cecil, on the key where Cecil Jacobs lives. So instead of coming down that main street past the Finches and then turning at the Radleys to go to school, he's so scared he goes all the way around past the courthouse, takes that other long north-south street down to the school. Cecil Jacobs, who lived at the far end of our street next door to the post office, walked a total of 1 mile per school day to avoid the Radley place and old Mrs. Henry Lafayette DuBose. Now, Mrs. DuBose lived 2 doors up the street from us. Neighborhood opinion was unanimous that Mrs. DuBose was the meanest old woman who ever lived. Period. Jem wouldn't go by her place without Atticus beside him. Well, what do you reckon we ought to do, Jem? Well, finders were keepers unless title was proven. Now, plucking an occasional camellia, getting a squirt of hot milk from Miss Maudie Atkinson's cow on a summer day, helping ourselves to someone's scuppernongs, that was part of our ethnical culture. But money was different. So, what are scuppernongs? Scuppernongs are a type of grape. So, even though Miss Maudie lives cattywampus from across from the Finches, she's got a back 40 and she's got her own cow. Own cow, eats grass, got some milk, There you go. So all those things of watering the flowers, having some of the cow's milk, eating the wild grapes. It was great. Tell you what, said Jim, we'll keep them until school starts and then go around and ask everybody if they're theirs. Well, there's some bus childs, maybe. He was too taken up with getting out of school today and forgot them. These are somebody's. I know that. Well, see how they've been slicked up? They've been saved. Yeah, but why would somebody want to put away chewing gum like that? You know it doesn't last. I don't know, Scout, but these are important to somebody. How's that, Jim? Well, Indian heads. Indian heads, they come from the Indians and they're real strong magic. They make you have good luck. Not like fried chicken when you're not looking for it, but things like long life and good health and passing 6 weeks tests. These are real valuable to somebody. I'm gonna put them in my trunk. Now, before Jim went to his room, he looked for a long time at that Radley place, and he seemed to be thinking again. 2 days later, Dill arrived in a blaze of glory. He'd ridden the train by himself from Meridian to Macomb Junction, a courtesy title. Macomb Junction was in Abbott County, where he had been met by Miss Rachel in Macomb's one taxi, and he'd eaten dinner in the diner, and he'd seen two twins hitched together to get off the train in Bay St. Louis, and stuck to his story regardless of threats. He had discarded the abominable blue shorts that were buttoned to his shirts, and he wore real short pants with a belt. He was somewhat heavier, no taller, and he said he'd seen his father. Dale's father was taller than ours. He had a black beard, pointed, and he was president of the L&L Railroad. I helped the engineer for a while, said Dale, yawning. In a pig's ear you did, Dale. Hush, said Jim. What will we play today? Tom and Sam and Dick, said Dale. Let's go to the front yard. Dale wanted the Rover Boys because there were 3 respectable parts. He was clearly tired of being our character man. I'm tired of those, I said. I was tired of playing Tom Rover, who suddenly lost his memory in the middle of the picture show and was out of the script until the end when he was found in Alaska. Make us up one, Jim, I said. I'm tired of making them up. Our first days of freedom, and we were tired. Ugh, I wondered what the summer would bring. We'd strolled to the front yard where Dale stood looking down the street at the dreary face of the Radley house. I smell death, he said. I do. I mean it, he said when I told him to shut up. You mean when somebody's dying, you can smell it? No, I mean I can smell somebody and tell if they're going to die. An old lady taught me how. Dale leaned over and he sniffed me. Jean Louise Finch, you're going to die in 3 days. Dale, if you don't hush, I am going to knock you bow-legged. I mean it now. Oh, y'all, hush, growled Jim. You act like you believe in hot steams. Well, you act like you don't, I said. What's a hot steam? Asked Dale. Well, haven't you ever walked along a lonesome road at night and you passed by a hot place? Jim asked Dale. A hot steam's somebody who can't get to heaven, just wallows around on lonesome roads, and if you walk through him, when you die, you'll get one too, and you'll go around at night sucking people's breath. Well, how can you keep from passing through one? Yeah, I can't, said Jim. Sometimes they stretch all the way across the road. But if you have to go through one, you say, Angel bright, life and death, get off the road, don't suck my breath. That keeps them from wrapping around you. Don't you believe a word he says, Dale, I said. Calpurnius says that's end talk. Now I'm going to take a moment because usually when I read this, I will say it to keep in context with the book. I can't say it anymore. It makes me sick to my stomach. So when I say end talk, you know that means the N word. Or we'll hear N lover. And you know what that means. Okay? When you think about the hot steams, think about that like I always think about the movie Hocus Pocus. Winifred Sanford, she's going to suck the life out of you. And that's the similar thing that Jim's talking about. Okay. Jim scowled darkly at me, but said, well, we're going to play anything or not. Oh, let's roll in the tire, I suggested. Jim said, you know I'm too big. Then you can push. Have any of you ever, in a big tractor tire, a bigger tire, had somebody and you roll in it? I could do it when I was little, but I still got motion sick. Woof. But it was fun. I ran to the backyard and I pulled an old car tire from under the house and I slapped it up to the front yard. I'm first, I said. Dale said he ought to be first. He just got here. Well, Jim arbitrated, awarded me first push with an extra time for Dale, and I folded myself inside that tire. Now, until it happened, I did not realize that Jim was offended by my contradicting him on hot steams and that he was patiently awaiting an opportunity to reward me. He did by pushing the tire down the sidewalk with all the force in his body. Ground, sky, houses melted into a mad pallet. My ears throbbed. I was suffocating. I could not put out my hands to stop. They were wedged between my chest and my knees. I could only hope that Jim would outrun the tire and me, or that I would be stopped by a bump in the sidewalk. I heard him behind me, chasing and shouting. Now, the tire bumped on gravel, skittered across the road, crashed into a barrier, and popped me like a cork onto the pavement. Dizzy and nauseated, I lay on the cement and I shook my head still, pounded my ears to silence, and then I heard Jim's voice. Scout, get away from there! Come on! I raised my head and I stared at the Radley Place steps in front of me. I froze. Come on, Scout, don't just lie there, Jim was screaming. Get up, can't you? I got to my feet trembling as I thawed. Get the tire, Jim hollered. Bring it with you. Ain't you got any sense at all? Now, when I was able to navigate, I ran back to them as fast as my shaking knees would carry me. Why didn't you bring it? Jim yelled. Why don't you get it? I screamed. Jim was silent. Go on, it ain't far inside the gate. Why, you even touched the house once. Remember? Jim looked at me furiously, could not decline, ran down the sidewalk, treaded water at the gate, then dashed in, retrieved the tire. See there? Jim was scowling triumphantly. Nothing to it. I swear, Scout, sometimes you act so much like a girl, it's mortifying. There was more to it than he knew, but I decided not to tell him. Calpurnia appeared in the front door and yelled, Lemonade time! Y'all get in out of the hot sun before you fry alive. Oh, lemonade in the middle of the morning was a summertime ritual. Calpurnia set a pitcher and 3 glasses on the porch and then went about her business. Now, being out of Jim's good graces did not worry me especially. Lemonade would restore his good humor. Jim gulped down his second glassful and he slapped his chest. I know what we're going to play, he announced. Something new, something different. What? asked Dale. Bo Radley. Now, Jim's head at times was transparent. He thought that up to make me understand he wasn't afraid of Radley's in any shape or form, to contrast his own fearless heroism with my cowardice. Boo Radley. How? asked Dale. Jim said, well, Scout, you can be Mrs. Radley. Oh, I declare if I will. I don't think... Smatter, said Dale. You still scared? Well, he can get out at night while we're all asleep, I said. Jim hissed. Scout, how's he going to know what we're doing? Besides, I don't think he's still there. He died years ago. They stuffed him up the chimney. Dale said, Jim, you and me can play and Scout can watch if she's scared. Well, I was fairly sure Boo Radley was inside that house, but I couldn't prove it and felt it best to keep my mouth shut, or I'd be accused of believing in hot steams. phenomena I was immune to in the daytime. Now, Jim parceled out our roles. I was Mrs. Radley, and all I had to do was come out and sweep the porch. Dale was old Mr. Radley. He walked up and down the sidewalk and coughed when Jim spoke to him. Jim, naturally, was Boo. He went under the front steps and shrieked and howled from time to time. Now, as the summer progressed, so did our game. And we polished and perfected it. We added dialogue and plot until we had manufactured a small play upon which we rang changes every day. Dill was a villain's villain. He could get into any character part assigned him and appear tall if height was part of the devilry and required. He was as good as his worst performance, and his worst performance was gothic. I reluctantly played assorted ladies who entered the script. I never thought it was as much fun as Tarzan, and I played that summer with more than vague anxiety, despite Jim's assurances that Boo Radley was dead and nothing could get me with him and Calpurnia there in the daytime and Atticus home at night. Jim was a born hero, and he was a melancholy little drama. It was woven from bits and scraps of gossip and neighborhood legend. Mrs. Radley had been beautiful until she married Mr. Radley and lost all her money. She also lost most of her teeth, her hair, and her right forefinger. That's Dill's contribution. Boo bit it off one night when he couldn't find any cats and squirrels to eat. So she sat in the living room and cried most of the time while Boo slowly whittled away all the furniture in the house. Now, the three of us were the boys who got into the trouble, and I was the probate judge for a change. And Dill led Jim away and crammed him beneath the steps, poking him with the push broom. And Jim would reappear as needed in the shapes of the sheriff and assorted townsfolk and Miss Stephanie Crawford, who had more to say about the Radleys than anybody in makeup. Now, when it was time to play Boo's big scene, Jim would sneak into the house, steal the scissors from the sewing machine drawer when Calpurnia's back was turned, and then sit in the swing and cut up newspapers. And Dill would walk by, cough at Jim, and Jim would fake a plunge into Dill's thigh. Well, from where I stood, it looked real. So, guys, what are they in essence doing? They're playing a game. But what are they doing? They're making fun of somebody. They are hardcore. This would be bullying. They're making fun of somebody. They don't realize it. Okay. Now, when Mr. Nathan Radley passed us on his daily trip to town, we would stand still and silent until he was out of sight, and then wonder what he would do to us if he suspected. Our activities halted when any of the neighbors appeared, and once I saw Miss Maudie Atkinson staring across the street at us, her hedge clippers poised in midair. Well, one day we were so busy playing Chapter 25, Book 2 of One Man's Family, we did not see Atticus standing on the sidewalk looking at us, slapping a rolled newspaper against his knee. The sun said 12 noon. What are y'all playing? He asked. Nothing, said Jim. Jim's evasion told me that our game was secret, so I kept quiet. What are you doing with those scissors? Why are you tearing up that newspaper? If that's today's, I will tan you. Nothing. Nothing what? Said Atticus. Nothing, sir. Now then, you give me those scissors, Atticus said. They're no things to play with. Does this by chance have anything to do with the Radleys? No, sir, said Jim, reddening. I hope it doesn't, he said shortly, and he went inside the house. Jim, shut up. He's gone in the living room. He can hear us in there. So safely in the yard, Dill asked Jim if we would play anymore. I don't know. Atticus didn't say we couldn't. Jim, I said, I think Atticus knows it anyway. No, he don't. If he did, he'd say he did. I wasn't so sure, But Jim told me I was being a girl and that girls always imagine things, and that's why other people hated him so. And if I wanted to start behaving like one, I could just go off and find some to play with. All right. All right. You just keep it up then. I said, you'll find out. Atticus's arrival was the second reason I wanted to quit the game. The first reason happened the day I rolled into the Radley front yard, and through all the head shaking, quelling of nausea, and Jem yelling, I had heard another sound, so low that I would not have heard it from the sidewalk. Someone inside the house was laughing. So lots to think about here, guys. Lots to think about. Children that are making fun of another individual and they don't realize that it's making fun. We've got a whole slew of things about how we treat people. And I want you to remember what Atticus had said. You don't know exactly how a person's feeling until you try to walk around on their skin. That doesn't mean literally, ew. But that means the world is not about you. You have to start looking at people around you. You need to start empathizing, not sympathizing. We've been talking about this all year, man's inhumanity to man. So we're talking about not feeling sorry for somebody, not giving them crap, not bullying them, but taking the moment. And this is what it means to become an adult. And there are a lot of adults that don't do it, or they were never taught to do it. But taking the moment and trying to look at someone's perspective on the other side. Now, if someone says it's okay to bully somebody, then we need to really have a discussion about that perspective of it. Because we don't know how that person was raised. Maybe they were raised by a bully. Maybe they were taught to bully. But you have to think about things in full circle. And while we all have our it's all about me moment, it really isn't. The world is so small and yet so large. We have to start looking at those around us. It's time as teenagers to start thinking about being that kinder, gentler person, to think about things before your mouth goes, which sometimes is hard, I will totally admit. But these kids, and Scout, she's bright. She's learned how to read, but she's innocent when it comes to the world. She's innocent in regards to the cruelty that's out there. So things that I want you to think about as you work on those questions, as you reflect, how it makes you feel, how you predict of what's going to happen. Okay? All right. I'll see you on the next chapters. Goodbye.